main question I always get was, am I going to be replaced? I'm like, no, not at all. And here's why. And I think as soon as you start to really understand the technology, yes, the capabilities of the technology, but also the limitations of it. They're like, oh, okay, maybe my job will change. It will have a profound impact for sure. But will it imply massive layoffs in newsrooms? I don't think so.
Hello, and welcome to the Media Copilot. It's a podcast that explores how AI is changing media, journalism, and content creation. I'm Pete Pachal, longtime tech journalist and founder of the Media Copilot, and I'm excited to bring you fascinating conversations with fellow journalists, media executives, and the people building how the business of news will work in the future. This week, I welcome Florent Daudens to the pod. Florent is a longtime Canadian journalist and is now the press lead at Hugging Face, which, if you're familiar with AI, you probably know well. It's basically the go-to site for guidance on AI models, especially open source. If you've used a language model outside of ChatGPT, there's a good chance it was hosted, benchmarked, or fine-tuned on Hugging Face. So Florent is right at the intersection of journalism and the AI developer community. Before joining Hugging Face, he worked for the CBC and he was a newsroom leader himself. Now he's helping bridge the gap between the people building the models and the people telling the stories. Florent and I talk about how to get past journalists' understandable skepticism about AI. There's still a lot of that going around, I'm told, but probably a little less today. We talk about a phenomenon I've chatted about here and there that editorial and product teams are merging, and probably why reporters who adopt a product mentality, at least a little bit, will probably be successful. And we even map out what the Internet of Agents might look like in a few months. So stay tuned for that. And if you do find the conversation interesting, I'd encourage you to share it with a friend or a colleague. I'd also be grateful if you'd consider subscribing to the Media Copilot newsletter if you haven't already. Links in the show notes. Also, a couple quick notes. One, I'm offering a monthly class on AI for beginners. It's only 60 minutes, and like everything I do, it's focused on practical takeaways for media professionals, people in journalism, PR, or communications. And it's only $49. Each one's a live class, so it's always up to date, and I guarantee you'll walk away with something you can apply in your day to day. You can sign up at mediacopilot.ai. Also, for deeper, more comprehensive training, I'm offering 2 extended courses in the fall. Each one lasts 6 weeks, and one is for journalists and the other's for PR and comms. These are loaded with lessons on things like deep research, how to automate workflows, and building your own first AI agent. There's tons of live workshopping, plus you get to do a project that's personalized for you, so you're guaranteed to upgrade the way you work. You can sign up for those courses at where else? mediacopilot.ai. Okay, now on with the show and my conversation with Florent Daudens of Hugging Face. Florent, welcome to the Media Copilot.
Hi, Chris. Thanks for the invitation.
Cool. Well, thanks for coming. I'm super glad you're here. Thrilled to talk to you. I'm always excited when I see one of your LinkedIn posts because you give so much great information, and there's like stuff on tools and insights that are super helpful, not just to journalists, but certainly for journalists. And I found tons of stuff thanks to you, and I'm super glad we're finally able to sort of sit down and chat. I've been wanting to do this for a while. But I think a lot of people who know you probably know you like I know you, like, oh, this guy who works for Hugging Face, which if people out there don't know, is a really big deal in the AI community. It's basically the place online where if you want any guidance or access to models, especially open source models, it's a very important site. And you're the press lead there, and people probably know you from, again, your a lot of the things you share online. But tell me a little bit more about you, Florent the man. I mean, you've been a longtime journalist, obviously from Canada,
Yes.
and been quite active in sort of teaching, etc. Well, you tell me, tell me more about how you got into this side of media
Mhm.
and journalism, I guess, and how you ended up at Hugging Face.
No, it's a good question. Well, actually, yeah, I've been a journalist for like 20 years, and I've done many different things. Beat reporter, and then I specialized. I think like the red thread is technology has always been important for me in my career. So I've been a data journalist, a social media editor, and then more like a digital editor. And then for almost 10 years, I've been more in the managing side of Newsroom. So I've been the managing editor of Le Devoir, which is a newspaper here in Canada, kind of newspaper of record, where basically we went through a big digital shift. So we went from being basically a print edition to a digital media. So we set up video teams, data visualization, engagement, audience teams, and so on. And so we went from, I think, 45 people to 150, and
Oh, wow.
we became
Nice
profitable
expansion.
actually. So it was great. And
Was this like the early 2010s or when was this?
good question. I think I was there between 2016 and 2022. And
Oh, okay.
then, I went back to the CBC, so the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, which is basically, TV, radio, and digital. I went back there as a manager again, managing the foreign bureaus, political bureaus, and so on. And as at Le Devoir and at the CBC, I really began to start up some AI projects, mostly in collaboration with engineering schools. So here at Montreal, we have the Polytechnic School, and at Le Devoir, for example, we set up it was a draft, we based on GPT-2. We were basically able to write a draft based on the stats coming from Statistics Canada about inflation. And so, like in less than a second, we had a very good draft with the whole the historical context. Like, is it the highest inflation rate this month in the last, I think, 100 years, and so on. So I really began to have a good grasp of the importance of I would say
Hmm.
10 years ago. And when I was at CBC, ChatGPT came up, and I was like, oh, I think it's really important for everyone in the company, in the newsroom, to understand the importance of that. So I basically focused on education and training. So we set up some training sessions and also ethical guidelines and AI projects. So we took several really specific products developed at the CBC. So it was like, for example, a story-like format that we had on the mobile app, and we basically thought about, oh, is it possible to have some help from AI to basically have a good draft and accelerate the production
Hmm.
of this format. So that there was this first experiments, and then I was like, oh, I I really feel like there are some tectonic shifts in the industry, and I want to have a broader impact on it. So I was really interested in transitioning into tech, and I think open source is kind of a natural fit for me, especially with my data journalist background. Uh, and I know open source and
Mhm.
journalism have much in common. So Hugging Face was kind of a natural fit for me, and I joined more than a year ago, and I'm really enjoying it. It's the pace of innovation and of development, and we can really feel like we are at the epicenter of what's happening.
That's an interesting thing you just said, where you said open source and journalism have a lot in common. I actually don't think a lot of people would make that connection instinctively. I think I know what you mean, but like unpack that a little bit for me. What are sort of the similar ethoses of those two fields, and why was it such a sort of natural step for you to take?
hmm Well, I think it's related to two different aspects. The first one being, for journalism, you need first independence and transparency about what you're using as tools and data sets and so on. And so, for example, when you take an open source model, well, there is a spectrum of openness, but let's say you have the open weights or the fully open source model where you can see what data has been used for the training steps and so on. You can really evaluate what are the risks in terms of, for example, bias in this model and so on. So you can really understand it better. And then about independence, when you have plenty of choices for different models and so on, your you're more able to keep your independence from just one provider. And so it's
Mhm.
basically, and it's something really, really important for us, like fighting the concentration of power, because especially with AI, it's a foundational technology. There's plenty of money poured into this sector. And so the risk of concentration is very high. It requires a lot of, CPUs and so on. So when you have more competition, well, I think for journalism it's better. And also, a third aspect, I think that is really important. When I learned a ton when I was a data journalist by just sharing some code with, other journalists around the world, and looking at what they're doing, and, having some open source libraries that were really, really powerful to help us basically getting up to speed. So I think it's really the same with open source AI. It's basically a huge accelerator of innovation. You can build on top of libraries, of models, of data sets, and you don't have to start from scratch. And so to understand the mechanics of it and how it works, and to make it your own, kind of, I think it's super important for that.
Nice. I want to get a little bit into the weeds on some of that in a minute, but I would like you just to stay in the past for just a second,
Sure.
for because I am curious about your experience at CBC, and then what things were like, particularly in the early days of generative AI. Now, I'm not looking for gossip or whatever, but I would imagine that there was some skepticism from the journalists there, and leading trainings and sort of trying to build a bridge, I guess, into this future where AI was definitely going to be a part. Can you talk a little bit about that in terms of the sort of resistance you might see, not just at the CBC, but in other places that you interact with, and how that's changed maybe since the early days of AI, sort of what it was like back then, and do you feel that there's either less skepticism or skepticism about different things? What is your sense of the evolution of media and journalism's relationship with AI, just in terms of how it's regarded, even? Because I do feel like that, particularly in this field, is a factor, because a lot of people perceive it as existential, as kind
Mhm.
of almost like an existential threat. So,
It
so
is.
tell me about that journey for you, and then sort of what you've seen sort of broadly.
I think it's really a super interesting question because, just to give you an anecdote, when I started at Hugging Face, and I mean, I talked to lots of newsrooms, to many different journalists from different backgrounds. Some of them are really technical, some of them are really not technical at all. And in the first few months, I think the main question I always get was, "Am I going to be replaced?" I'm like,
Mhm.
"No, not at all." And here's why. And I think as soon as you start to really understand the technology, yes, the capabilities of the technology, but also the limitations of it. They're like, oh, okay, maybe my job will change. It will have a profound impact for sure. But will it imply massive layoffs in newsrooms? I don't think so, honestly, especially, for journalism, I think there is an important aspect of when there is a big risk of disintermediation between the audience and the news organizations or the journalists by AI, because as a user you can ask your AI to basically bring you the news and score the web for you and so on. But when you have this intermediation, I think users will crave for more human and social connections, and I think this is where journalism has a powerful card to play, because you know why are we following some journalists on TikTok or Instagram or whatever? It's because we trust them. We feel like we have a connection with them. So it's super important. So you know, I think, and especially with journalists, I think as soon as you have some proper training and or good understanding of technology, it's really more like, okay, how can I engage with the technology? And I had this exercise that I really liked in my training sessions. We started the training session by just like, what's AI for you in one word? And typically the words were like fear, replacement, catastrophe, or whatever. And at the end of the session, I was like, we're gonna do the same exercise. You can keep your word if you want, but the words were totally different. It was more like possibilities, risks, yes, but also exploration and kind of empowerment. And I think it's fundamental for newsrooms today to be like, how can we make sure that everyone is on the same page about AI? Because
Mm,
yes, you can have some really small teams specialized in AI that understand the technology very well, but it's the same as the digital shift we did several years ago, like the eternal digital shift kind of. If you just put it into the hands of several people, but it's not like transformative at the scale of the newsroom, well, you don't you won't have the benefits of that. And so you really
mm.
have to make it possible for everyone to imagine possibilities, ideas, products, I don't know, but this is where you're gonna create value. And one important shift that a personal shift for me, when you're in a tech company, you quickly realize that when you write code, you basically create value. And I think
Mm,
with AI, what we can do now is when you write prompts, which is basically with your own words, you're creating a ton of value. And so when you
mm.
realize that as an organization, I think it's very powerful. But it's kind of a different shift, it's a different mindset, I think.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think, I sort of waver between like, is prompt engineering important or isn't it? And then if it is, then now how does it evolve as the models evolve too, right? Because honestly, even in my training, sort of the way I even approach prompting has changed considerably in the last 6 to 8 months, I would say, with thinking models and sort of more collaborative exercises and tasks you can do with them. It's really I don't want to get too much into the weeds on that with you, even though I'm sure we could probably talk for an hour about sort of the way to approach things. But I do want to talk about bringing people into this once they're sort of persuaded, okay, and they want to start sort of figuring this stuff out. Um, there's I think a bit of a learning curve depending on what you're doing. So I'll confess sometimes I'll go to your posts and I'm super excited about whatever you're sharing, and I sort of end up on a GitHub page and I get a little bit lost about like, and I'm not like a coder, like that's maybe the problem, you know what I mean? Like then that's where I sort of get a little intimidated, even though I've been covering tech for 20 years. So I do feel like there's sort of a stair step here from sort of prompt engineering, not quite to engineering, but there's to really sort of unlock stuff for yourself. There's probably a little bit of at least product thinking you have to mix in with the AI. I'm very just really curious, like, how do you approach that? Like, because I have a deep desire to want to get to like your level, right? Of like, oh, I'm super comfortable in GitHub and I can sort of throw together some MCP stuff or whatever else. And I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, what's MCP? What's he talking about?
Yeah.
But it is like you got to sort of start somewhere that leads there. How do you sort of get people on board, and how do you think about that learning curve, even as because the space is sort of rapidly changing. A lot of the stuff I'm even describing is starting to get abstracted away.
Yeah, indeed. The funny thing is, I'm not a coder too, and I'm pretty bad at it. But so it's kind of reassuring, I guess. And sometimes when I share code with my colleagues who are really good engineers, I'm like, I'm shy, but it works. That's the main thing. But I think the best way to approach that is basically yes, prompt engineering. And engineering is like a big word, but it's just like think about your what you want to achieve. What do you want to achieve, and then how can the machine help you do that? And the first
Right.
prompt will be probably crap. The result is going to be bad. But then you can be like, okay, how can I improve it? And how can I build on top of that? And then you become more and more comfortable with having something really, really interesting. I think you're right to point out that many things that are complicated today will become really easy tomorrow. And for example, you know, with vibe coding, um, there are still
Mm,
a kind of world that you have to cross because yes, Lovable, Cursor, and so on, they're really good at giving you some code, but then you have to run it somewhere. And so if you don't have that knowledge, it's like, ooh, what? what can I do? Or, to just give up. But you can totally imagine, and you can already see it. You can have some really easy to use platforms. I have this example in mind. It's called DeepSite. It's one of my colleagues who did it, and you can basically revamp your website by just a prompt, and you can deploy it with just one click. So you don't have to write any code. You
Nice.
let the machine run it. So it's kind of super interesting for that. And then you also have, I think, more and more integration of AI into or tools. For example, the browser I'm using right now is DI I think it's a beta version of uh, it's made by the browser company, and so
Okay.
basically it's super interesting. And I'm not like doing some advertisement from them or whatever, but the product is kind
Mhm.
of cool because it gives us an idea of where AI is heading, kind of. So it's a browser, but with a chat tab that is kind of always open on your on the right, and so you can basically interact with your content on every tab, and you kind of remember everything about your interactions on the web. But you can ask the browser to perform really deep tasks with your content, such as, help me, give me like the most important news in AI today. And so it will like retrieve content from Google News, it will summarize it, and it will write you like several bullet points if you want, and so on. That's the kind of workflow that 6 months ago you would need to code, but today it's
Mhm.
like you prompt it into your browser and then it works. And if we kind of shift altitude and think about, okay, in a newsroom or, in my daily practice as a journalist, what can I do with that? I think it's also all comes down to how do you build teams today? The most successful teams I've seen in the use of AI are the same that were able to be cross-functional in the digital shift they took several months or years ago. So if you have some engineers with you, some product designers, and journalists, and you put them together, and they are able to have at least a common language or a common understanding of the possibilities. Well, there you have something that can really, really shine because you have deep expertise in different areas, but you bring them in common, and then you can build something really, really cool with that.
Yeah, and I feel like part of the almost the consequence of what you're describing is almost like a merger. It's not quite a merger, but it is. I do feel like there's definitely a phenomenon that AI brings to the foray, which is that journalists start to think more like product, people, and think about not just the possibilities of what they can do with it, but also like how people are encountering what they're putting out there through things like chatbots and whatever. And at the same time, the product people and engineers, because so much of what is now determining outputs is like natural language, those skills of like just mastering language is super important. And that so I think a greater understanding of like the product of news, because obviously it's about words and information. And so there's kind of like this almost flattening of those skill sets that's happening a little bit.
Yes,
Um,
flattening,
yeah.
but also I think a fundamental shift, and it's maybe not directly related to AI, but I think like, when we talk about, for example, news avoidance, disintermediation, and so on, those are big concepts. But the thing is, when you think about journalism as a specialization, for years it's been, oh, our specialization is just news. We talk about the news, we talk about what's happening and so on. Okay. But then we realized, oh, okay, maybe more and more people don't come to us. They don't come to our websites. I was reading the Reuters digital report yesterday, where, in the US, social media is more important than TV right now. So it's a big shift. And for all age groups, by the way. So
Right.
I think as a journalist, yes, our specialization is to work with news, but we also need to think about what do people need, kind of, and what what kind of questions do they have, and then how can we answer to it? And so it's a big shift because it's more about thinking about your audience than just solely thinking about the news. And that's a lot. So, better not to be alone in that. But, having this, I think it's going to be a super important skill to have as a journalist to be
Mm.
able to empathize with your audience and understand and kind of translate, okay, how can I bring the news to them in the way that is the most efficient for them and especially in the age of AI.
Yeah, and I found that interesting too because if you looked at the whole chart, and I think you pointed this out even that chatbots were low on terms of how people were actually getting information, but that doesn't mean AI is not involved in those other ways. Like I feel like AI is just such a part of the ecosystem. Like certainly a lot of social media copy today is created by AI. You look at some of the experiences; some of these are pretty relatively new, but even on media websites, right? So, just in the past few weeks, we've had Time AI come out with their audio brief. I think Business Insider's doing something similar. So, in other words, there's these. Even the media companies themselves are kind of disintermediating between their own reporters. So as a person who is in that business, I suppose, sort of beyond this, when you get past the is AI going to take my job fear, which is a little misplaced. There's the, well, wait a minute, am I now just a worker in the information mines, and I'm hammering out the raw material of facts or whatever, or sources or quotes, and I'm just going to end up feeding that into a machine that just turns it into some whatever format the person wants. That's a little extreme, but it does feel like we're kind of on a path towards some version of that. um, I don't know. Like, what do you think? Do you think people will end up just sort of writing stories like they always have and they get reinterpreted, or is it going to be more of rapid fire? Let's just crank out bullet points, and then the Bloomberg engine. I always think of Bloomberg when I think of bullet points,
Yeah.
and then it just turns it into something comprehensible.
Yeah.
Feels like it's a thing that's happening, but I don't know. Where do you see this trend going?
It's really fascinating, I think, to think about that because there's lots of discussions about liquid content, like, oh, we're just gonna,
Mm.
feed the machine with facts and it will spit out to the users the way they want. Um, Maybe, but I think, journalism is more than that. Journalism is about making sense of the news. So I think it's going to be super important. Maybe like the act or the value of writing a well-structured article will be less important. I don't know. It might be. But the thing is, news gathering and the depth of understanding what does it mean, and oh, X politician just said that it's a shift in its public discourse, and here's what it means, and so on. I think it's still super important, and so how are we going to be able to articulate it in AI? It's going to be important to think about it, and I think you're really right to point out that some media companies are starting to think about AI products. And I think this is right now the most important thing to do with AI because
Mhm.
we focused a lot on productivity tools as the beginning, and it's normal with this innovation waves. We're always like, oh, okay, cool, it brings us more productivity or different ways to do things we already do. But then you really have to think about, okay, what am I building for my audience? Especially because, from the vantage point of Hugging Face, we're seeing a flurry of models being released each week. So basically, it means models are being commoditized. Tech companies will
Mm.
make probably less money from models, so they will focus on building products. I mean, if you look at Anthropic and OpenAI recently, the most recent announcements has not been about models, they has been about products. So
Right.
what does it mean for a news organization? That means a lot. Can you find your place in their environment and how you can convey the depth of your analysis in a ChatGPT summary about the news? It might be complicated, but not impossible. But if you have control on your products, then you can really build products that will make your editorial expertise shine. And this is the most important thing. But it's also the hardest because it's not so much about the technology, but really about, okay, what does journalism mean today, and how do we convey this to the audiences? Uh, that's the trickiest part.
Mm. I want to come back to something you kind of touched on earlier, because now that we're sort of talking about newsrooms and how they should sort of think about products, I also just want to think about, like, how they're adapting. It's like beyond just deploying AI, there's a whole layer to just the business of it that is like, oh, as AI disintermediates, there's less traditional discovery channels. So certainly social and search have been dwindling for a while, but now definitely feels like that's going to accelerate now that AI mode is sort of a new, it's very present, et cetera. So they're making these decisions, and famously, a lot of bigger newsrooms have um, sign deals with OpenAI or others, and usually it's couched as sort of a strategic partnership. Um, but then that almost like locks them into a model, So like that's sort of was a part of the Business Insider sort of announcement recently, where they were like, we're all in on AI, and a lot of our people are using enterprise chat GPT, and well, it's obviously because they've signed something with OpenAI. So by sort of going in this sort of almost necessary decision of survival, like we need to get this revenue, are they unnecessarily kind of locking themselves into something that might not be the best way to sort of deploy tools, or just at least limiting their options, considering, they'd probably go there first, even if they certainly are able to do open source stuff, they're probably not um, going to be as inclined. Um, I don't know. Do you think that's too limiting?
It's a good question. I mean, I talked to lots of newsroom, including those who have deals with OpenAI or Amazon now,
Right.
and I I don't feel it it impairs their capacity to explore different models. I think
Mhm.
it's like, oh, we have this possibility, so yes, we can deploy some models to the newsroom, but for specific products, we will explore different models. We will evaluate, which one is the best, and so on. So I think it's really a mix. The same way we saw it with basically software, and we're using many, many different softwares on a daily basis. And I think with AI, it's going to be technically the same. You will just decide what kind of approach or model is the best for you, and then you're going to deploy it. But I think it's really important, and I really enjoy your episode about, for example, generative engine optimization and that kind of thing. It's really also all about how do you build direct relationship with your audience. I think this is
Yeah.
probably the most crucial question today.
Right. Yeah. 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 It's with whenever I sort of talk about, well, I actually don't even know what we're calling it. I feel like we're settling on AEO or AIEO, but the whole idea of optimizing your content for AI search engines is an interesting one, because I think it forces you to zoom out into the bigger question of, well, why would you want to? And that's not to say you shouldn't. It is to say that your goals are going to be different if you're going to optimize for something that is designed to not have to click through, right? So yeah, obviously, licensing factors into that, what winning means, and all the factors that go into placing there, which are slightly different from SEO. That said, it sort of brings up the whole question of measuring success and all this, and like, what do you think that is going forward? Like, a lot of these certainly bigger media companies are trying to plan around a kind of a Google zero future, which might be a little exaggerated. Like, I don't know if
Mhm.
search is going to zero, but it's definitely going to be a smaller part, a smaller role than it plays today. So then, how do you, I guess, as you sort of reimagine yourself, if you're an older AI company, um, is like, what would you advise people to look at in terms of, I guess, those sort of business KPIs or benchmarks, even of like, you've successfully made this transition, because you're probably going to be, in terms of those old numbers, probably they're probably going to be smaller, right?
Yeah, no, no, absolutely. And AI is changing the AI business, the ads business also. So it's for
Yeah.
sure there will be some huge shifts. I think, in terms of KPIs, we need to have a good understanding of how the conversion funnel will change, and each
Mm,
newsroom will have different decisions to make about how they position different AI products in this funnel. But for example, if you're big into like discoverability, for example, well, you know generative engine optimization totally makes sense. You want your content to be basically spread out everywhere in the chatbots. You want to be resurfaced in the results, and that makes sense. Maybe you won't have as many clicks as you did with Google, but at least the your brand is going to be really important in the daily basis of people. But then you can think about mechanisms to convert these people. So, for example, we talked about MCP very briefly, and without being too technical, MCP is like you can. I think
mhm,
we will see chatbots evolving as operating ecosystems, and so
right.
publishers, news organizations will probably be able to develop kind of AI apps that will live into these ecosystems. So there you can see that you go down to the funnel with a more like intense or direct relationship with your audience in the chatbot. So you can basically, for example, activate your subscription in the chatbot or whatever to I don't know, The Economist, the New York Times, and so on. You can activate your subscription in that, and so each time you ask the chatbot about the news, well, the content from your subscription will be resurfaced. And then you can have like first-hand experience for your audiences on your platforms, or you can completely imagine new products that you will develop with AI. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see what kind of data you will be able to gather in the sense that, for example, a classic Google query, I think, is 3 words. But I think on perplexity it's maybe 12 words. And let's say you have a voice product on your platforms, you will capture way more than just 3 words in a single query. So what do you make of that? Can you
Mm.
build more ingrained, like deep profiles about your users? Can you understand them better and so tailor the ads for them? Or, just if your model is all about subscription, can you bring them more content that is really meaningful for them instead of giving the same context for everyone, for example? So, how will you, what kind of KPIs will you establish really depends on your models, your business model and your editorial model. But I think uh, at the end of the day, the KPIs will be probably better, and you will have more more data, but also a
Mhm.
really better understanding of each subscriber or reader or viewer on your platforms. But you really need,
Yeah.
I think you're right to point it out. Like reimagining KPIs right now is really important for sure.
It's almost like that you kind of just said it there. It's almost like the understanding is almost the KPI, right? And I think that to expand it out to conventional stuff, it's like known versus unknown in terms of your audience, and the greater proportion of known is going to be incredibly important. Like you got to make your stuff unmissable, and you've got to make it sticky and have people want to tell them about it themselves to you.
And
Um,
one additional point would be you could have this really interesting feedback loop because if you are able to capture like what kind of questions do people have about the news, then you can
mm,
have this really interesting feedback loop to the newsroom and be like, hey, maybe we should imagine an AI format about to answer this specific question, and could be super interesting.
totally. So we're an AI podcast. We're obligated to say agent at least once, but I do want to, as we wrap up here, think about the future because it does definitely seem like we're going to have an internet of agents of some kind. Agents are going to be very meaningful for people getting the news. They're going to be meaningful for people producing the news, and also they're just going to be meaningful in general because if it's just agents going around and that's the traffic, you're going to have to do something with that. So how do you see, in it's almost like a rapid fire question, the agent uh, internet evolving? How is it going to affect those three things, basically reporters, readers, and also like the businesses that have to sort of oversee this?
Well, I think, we probably underestimate the effect of AI agents. And I think I might be wrong, but I can totally imagine a not so far future where AI agents will basically browse the web for us. So
Hmm.
if you imagine a future where we don't actively browse the web, what does it mean for ads? What does it mean for, UI, for example? Do we still need to focus a lot on building a great website that is basically made for humans, whereas maybe we should focus on having a machine readable website that is going to be able to ingest something? And there are protocols that are beginning to emerge that are agent to agents. So can I have my agent as a newsroom that is able to talk to the personal agents of my audience? So that's the kind, I think it's a really important shift, and we really need to prepare for it right now instead of waiting. Um, and it raises lots of questions about echo chambers and the diversity of
Hmm.
content you will have access to and so on. But it's also a really, really interesting opportunity. And one of the other shifts that will probably happen is the way our devices will evolve. I mean, Apple is basically worried about that. Like, what's the future of cell phones? And this market hasn't been basically hijacked in the last 20 years. It's gonna change. OpenAI that recently acquires John E startups is a big signal of that. So are we gonna interact with content? Like, will Screen be the most prominent device or interface with content in the next few years? I don't know. It might evolve. Like maybe voice is gonna be more important. Um, so
Yeah.
I have more questions than answers, but definitely, it's probably the biggest area of exploration that needs to be done right now.
Definitely, voice is going to be, in my view, going to be pretty big. I just, and this is kind of my bias, just based on my personal use. I've just started to chat with AI more and more, and I think a lot of people who use it that probably are similar. Cool. Well, let's just wrap up. I do like to end with a question on sort of probably giving advice to folks out there, but rather than the newsrooms or the people who are just starting out, I think if people have made it to the end of this conversation, they're probably a little bit steeped in this stuff. So if you are doing AI, if you fully embraced it as a journalist, as a newsroom, and you've made taken several steps, what in your view is sort of the biggest risk or the biggest thing to watch out for as you continue into a path of this AI future? What are some cautious words that you can sort of give them to make sure that they don't stumble?
Hmm, it's a good question. I think the biggest risk is probably not leveling up the playing field for everyone in the company, and I feel like we are probably part of this kind of AI interested community. We are deep into it. But how do you keep everyone to the same page around you, in your team, in your organization? I think it's probably the biggest risk because, as we said, if people don't understand the technology, there will be no adoption, internal adoption. So I think the biggest risk is probably like how do you how do you collectively manage this cultural change, and how do you make AI your own instead of also suffering from it, because AI is going to be implemented in many, many software devices and so on. So how do you still keep a level of agency as a person, as a journalist, as
Right.
an organization, and decide, yes, AI is useful there, but I don't want AI here? I think it's also going to be important, like keeping control on how you want to integrate AI in your work and in your life.
Nice. Disciplined use. I like that. Don't
Mm,
go for the
kind
easy
of.
stuff
Yes.
necessarily. Love it. 10 out of 10. Thank you very much, Florent. This has been amazing. Thanks for sharing your insights and keep on sharing them on LinkedIn because holy cow, do I get a lot of useful stuff from just your feed.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and I will continue to do it. And keep in mind that sometimes I won't redirect you to more complicated code.
Sounds good. All right. We'll see you again soon.
Talk soon. Bye, Pete.
Thanks for listening to my conversation with Florent Daudens of Hugging Face. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd appreciate it if you just take a minute to leave a rating and review for the Media Copilot in your podcast app. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the Media Copilot newsletter and check out mediacopilot.ai for our classes on AI for journalists, PR professionals, and communicators. Be seeing you in the future.